Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Max Sorum, the Executive Director for Carolina Public Humanities, and it's really a pleasure to be with you today. Today is, of course, a very special day marking the 80th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And before we begin, we want to acknowledge all who lost their lives that day and throughout that terrible conflict, and for all who have served and sacrificed in our armed services. Today is special because of this anniversary, but it is also special because it's the last of our scheduled events this fall, and what a special one it is with a very special presentation delivered by the esteemed historian Gerhard Weinberg. This program is also, as you know, being offered as a fundraiser for Carolina Public Humanities, and we thank you for joining us and considering giving to Carolina Public Humanities to help us sustain our important work. Why? Why are the humanities important in public life? I want to just, one way we can think about this is to look at the topics that we put on in our Humanities in Action lecture series, which we hold at Flyleaf Books this fall. We had programs on scientific literacy, countering disinformation, understanding just what exactly critical race theory is in legal terms, and also looking at how it is so hard to teach in our teach history in our high schools. These are the type of topics that give you a sense that our culture right now is suffering from a real dearth of critical thinking and also empathy to listen to others and to understand important topics for public life. Uh, CPA exists to promote that empathy, to promote humanistic dialogue and reflection on these important topics in today's world. And we do this among all of our state's many residents and engage its many diverse communities. We provide tools for community building around respect for difference and an honest engagement with our history by creating forums for thoughtful exchanges of ideas. How do we do that? We have three basic divisions: our lifelong learning programs, our community programs that many of you are familiar with, our Adventures and Ideas, weekend seminars, our Humanities in Action lecture series, special events, and of course, a lot of programs before this pandemic that we offered. Those are just one way that we can reach the public, and of course, we've been doing this since 1979. We also, of course, have Carolina K-12, an extensive teacher outreach program in which we bring the best scholarship and faculty from the University of North Carolina out to our state's teachers and provide them with the pedagogical tools they need to do our work in their classrooms. Again, promoting empathy, humanistic dialogue, and reflection on our history and shared public culture. We also have a very extensive community college program in which we are going out to community colleges all over the state of North Carolina and recreating these forums for humanistic dialogue at their sites. So why do we have to hold fundraisers? Well, we have no revenue for many of our K-12 programs and for our community college programs. Those initiatives are run entirely free for our partners and for their participants who join them. In normal times, we are running on tight margins, but since the pandemic, we have experienced strains on our budget that are unsustainable. 18 to 20% of our normal budget comes from tickets to our live events. Of course, live events are hard to run in a pandemic. We're happy that we've been able to do things virtually like this. We wouldn't have been able to do this today without learning about this during the pandemic, but virtual programs mean less money for Carolina Public Humanities, and that means less revenue across the board for all three areas of our work. When we compare average semester receipts from our pre-pandemic operations with those we received during COVID-19, we estimate our losses to date during this pandemic have amounted to nearly $200,000. And that's why we're here today, to ask you for help in sustaining Carolina Public Humanities in the upcoming year and in the future. I'm happy to say that we have raised over $20,000 in this fall campaign to date, but we need even more. And also to encourage you to give today, we would like to announce a very special challenge made by members of our advisory board. They have pledged up to $30,000 of additional matching funds for all money we raise today. That means that any gift you give today will have twice the impact. We are very thankful to our board for their generosity and hope it inspires you to support us today. So we want to get right into our program because we know you are very interested. We are going to have my colleague over here, Paul Bonici, who will be dropping in all sorts of links. I know he's already given you links on how to give to Carolina Public Humanities. You'll notice he's also been giving you information on our different funds. They include our gift for unrestricted funds, which is honestly where we need the most support at this moment. These monies help support our staff, help support programs across all three divisions. But we also, if you are interested in supporting specifically our Carolina K-12 fund, you may do that as well. And also, of course, our community college outreach fund. And I thank Paul for giving you information on that. And he'll be dropping in little reminders here and there about where you can give to Carolina Public Humanities. Now for the actual event itself. I don't need to read all of Gerhard Weinberg's wonderful bio here. We're going to drop that in there for you as well so you can read it. But I will say a few words. One is that Gerhard Weinberg is the William Rand Keenan Jr. Professor of History Emeritus. He is one of the most distinguished historians of the era of World War II in the world. His magisterial work, World at Arms, has been awarded several awards and is also perhaps the single best single volume of World War II history in the world. He also, one of the most interesting things, I think it's a wonderful story to hear too, is how he was, as an historian, found Hitler's unpublished sequel to Mein Kampf and spent about 30 years or maybe even 40 years working on getting that published. In addition to all of these publications, he is, again, take a look at the bio. I don't need to read all of this to you. You can read it yourself there. He's absolutely a force of nature, and we're so honored to be able to work with him so frequently. In fact, he gave a wonderful talk with us for Adventures and Ideas just a month ago. So how it will work, Dr. Weinberg will be right here. He will deliver his lecture, and please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll take a short break in the middle, and I can give you a few updates about some of the things that Carolina Public Humanities has done, and encourage you also to give to our programming. And then we'll return to Gerhard Weinberg's second part of the talk. Then Dr. Weinberg will take questions. Again, I remind you about the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So I want to thank you for joining us today. You're in for a real treat. I also want to thank you for considering giving to Carolina Public Humanities. And now please welcome Dr. Gerhard Weinberg. I can hear your applause.
It is my intention to talk about the global ramifications of the attack on Pearl Harbor. In the fall, of 1940, as it became clear to Adolf Hitler and his associates that Britain could neither be occupied nor forced to give in quickly, Hitler began to urge the Japanese to seize the British, French, and Dutch possessions in South and Southeast Asia on the assumption that such calamities, especially the loss of India, might lead to a British surrender. The response from Tokyo was that Japan planned and intended to do that, but in 1946. The German leaders quickly figured out that the reason the Japanese picked that particular year was because the United States had decided that the Philippines would become independent in 1944 and that the United States would give up its bases there 2 years later. The Japanese clearly did not want American forces on the left flank of their effort to seize the European colonies in South and Southeast Asia. Hitler intended to fight the United States after his European wars, and in 1937 had ordered the development and construction of the intercontinental bombers and super battleships that he considered necessary for that conflict. These projects were both underway, but nowhere near completion. But in his thinking, Japanese warplanes and warships could do a major part of the job. And so he promised to join Japan in war with the United States as soon as it started, preferably immediately. As the Japanese hesitated, he personally urged Japanese Foreign Minister Matsuoka, when they met on April 4th, 1941, not to delay, as the United States built up its navy and began to create a real army. The year 1941 thus came to see something of a diplomatic race between Hitler and the American President Franklin Roosevelt. While Roosevelt kept up negotiations with the Japanese in the hope that when they could see for themselves that a Germany that was still at war with Britain and then attacked the Soviet Union was not going to win the war, the Japanese would abstain from adding a war with the United States to the one they were already fighting in China since 1937. Hitler kept pushing the Japanese government to act. The sooner the better. Hitler won this race by a week. If the Japanese had waited another week, they would have seen the major check of the Germans by the Soviet counteroffensive before Moscow and the British defeat of the Italian force that had invaded Egypt, both in the first days of December 1941, and have refrained from attacking the US and Britain. Knowing that Hitler and the Italian leader Benito Mussolini, who was adhering to Hitler's policy on this issue, had often broken their treaties and promises, the leaders in Tokyo checked with Berlin and Rome a few days before sending out the fleet to strike Pearl Harbor. When reassured by both Berlin and Rome, they went ahead with their plan to attack Pearl Harbor as an opening for war with the United States, and they simultaneously struck British possessions in East Asia. When Hitler learned of the Japanese attack, he was enthusiastic. Here was an ally who did exactly what he had done earlier that year with the Sunday peacetime air attack on Yugoslavia's capital of Belgrade. The practical problem he faced, and that worried him very much, was that at that moment he was not in Berlin, but at his East Prussian military headquarters because of the crisis before Moscow and at both ends of the Eastern Front. It would take several days for him to get to Berlin, assemble the German parliament to give them the good news of war with the United States, and go through the appropriate diplomatic procedures of declaring war. To cope with this issue, he immediately ordered Admiral Raeder, the commander-in-chief of the German Navy, who had been urging war with the United States since October 1939, to have German submarines immediately start sinking American ships systematically. The formal declaration of war would be given to the representative in Berlin, publicly announced to the Reichstag, the German parliament, on December 11th. Mussolini, accordingly, also picked that date for Italy to declare war on the United States. There is an important but generally forgotten further aspect of the Japanese, German, and Italian initiation of war with the United States. In the following days of December, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria also declared war on the United States. President Roosevelt urged the Congress to declare war on Japan and subsequently on Germany and Italy, and the Congress did so. While he knew that Germany and Italy had submarines in the Atlantic and could thus take action against the US right away, why on earth did these other three European countries want war with the United States? And what could they do to us? In a step for which I do not know of any precedent in history, Roosevelt told the State Department to try through diplomatic channels to get these countries to withdraw their declarations of war and remain at peace with this country. American diplomats in Ankara, the capital of the then still neutral Turkey, did what they could through contacts with the diplomats of the three countries who were also there to implement the president's policy. The negotiations went on for months, but Regent Admiral Horthy of Hungary, the dictator Marshal Antonescu of Romania, and King Boris III of Bulgaria were certain that they and their countries could not be happy unless they also went to war with the United States. In the summer, Roosevelt gave up, and on June 18, 1942, sent a message to Congress explaining what had happened and recommending that Congress acknowledge the fact that a state of war between the three countries and the United States existed. Congress did so. During the war, American troops never fought against troops of the three, but the American Air Force bombed targets in all three, especially in Romania, with its oil fields and refineries so critical to the German war effort. It has always seemed to me that the contrast between Hitler's great worry about having to wait 3 or even 4 or 5 days to declare war on the United States, and Roosevelt trying for half a year to get countries to cancel their declarations of war on the U.S., constitutes a fine commentary on the public assertions in 1941 by Charles Lindbergh and other American firsters that Hitler was the advocate of peace and Roosevelt was a warmonger. There is a further international implication of the attack on Pearl Harbor and the subsequent expansion of the war that is often forgotten. As German submarines began sinking Brazilian ships, Brazil declared war on Germany and Italy, and a Brazilian army unit would eventually fight alongside American and British forces in the campaign in Italy. A whole host of other Latin American countries would join the Allied side, with Argentina being the last to do so. The United States and practically all Central and South American countries became allies in a war for the first time ever. There was also a change to the north of the United States as a result of the attack on Pearl Harbor. The United States and Canada have been on the same side in World War I. And in that war, Japan had also been on the Allied side. Excuse me. Now, Japan was at war with the United States and also with Canada. The two countries were, for good reasons, worried about Japanese attacks on their Pacific coast and on Alaska. So the Canadian government authorized the construction of a highway connecting the United States Northwest through the Canadian corridor with Alaska. What came to be known as the Alaska Highway was constructed in 1942 and with some modifications exists today. Friends of mine who have driven it assured me that it's a most scenic drive. It is easy to understand that the British Prime Minister and war leader Winston Churchill was pleased to have the United States now officially in the war alongside Britain. And he went to Washington in December of 41 for what was called the Arcadia Conference. The United States and Britain, in prior talks, had always agreed that if it came to a war in the Pacific, as well as Europe and Africa, the European theater would have priority. With the German a few miles across the channel, the British had no choice. And the invaded Soviet Union obviously had no choice either. From the American perspective, in spite of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Germany was in the long run the more dangerous enemy. Obviously, the United States would fight and hope eventually to crush Japan, but the European theater would become and remain the first charge on American military resources. At the Arcadia Conference, Roosevelt and Churchill established the combined chiefs of staff to plan and direct Allied operations, and also for the first time created the concept of a supreme commander who would control all the forces of both countries in a specific theater of operations as the war moved forward in the coming years. It was furthermore becoming clear that in many ways, the United States would be the dominant power in the evolution of Allied strategy. It is worth noting that in the following years, the Americans could and did at times push the British into accepting American strategic concepts by making the transfer of some American forces to the Pacific the expressed or implied alternative. The major role of the United States in Allied strategy that began with the Arcadia Conference was the obvious external aspect of what was happening inside the United States. In 1920, the American voters had decided to stop the Earth and get off, as the new President Warren Harding argued and preferred, and his successors, Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover, continued this policy. Many Americans remain convinced of this isolationist policy, but during the 1930s, the violent actions of Japan and subsequently of Hitler's Germany began to reduce their numbers and influence slightly. The news about the new war in Europe, especially the broadcasts from London during the Blitz, contributed to this trend, the way reports of Japanese atrocities in China had begun to do in regard to the Pacific. It was the attack on Pearl Harbor that transformed most of those Americans who had remained more or less isolationist. Whatever their prior views, millions entered the armed forces as draftees or volunteers, and the production of armaments that had been stimulated by British and French contracts and was pushed forward by the first stages of American rearmament was now driven to an enormous increase. That process included what was called the Manhattan Project, the development of atomic bombs. That project would not have proceeded with the urgency it did once the U.S. was formally in the war, but it would have proceeded anyway. Certainly none would have been dropped on Germany or Japan. But the attack on Pearl Harbor has to be seen as a dramatic push in the field of nuclear weapons development generally, not only in this country, but throughout the world. The other side of this is that Pearl Harbor would become a major goal of Japanese tourists after the war into the present time.
Thank you, Gerhard, for starting us out so wonderfully today. I want to remind everyone here that we are in the middle of our fundraiser for the fall campaign. We had a request, Gerhard, that I get you a little bit more volume, so I'm going to see if I can pull this over to the other side. This is how you see the attention to detail we have here at Carolina Public Humanities, folks. And that should maybe get you a little bit louder. A few things I just want to clarify. Thank you so much so far, and we'll get right back to our presentation. I want to remind you why we are here, folks. Our revenue is down $200,000, and that's from our ticketed programs over the past 2 years. And those, of course, go on to support all of our programming. So non-ticketed programming that it supports includes our community college initiative. And here's a little figure for you. Since we started the community college initiative in 2016, we have reached out to 26 different partners, have had over 95 discussion events, and have reached over 7,400 people. For Carolina K-12, the other part of our organization that does not have revenue, we are doing wonderful work teaching hard history. Right now, there's an event going on with teachers who are learning about Wilmington 1898 in a virtual program that's being offered right now. And just in 2021 alone, we have reached over 1,500 teachers with Carolina K-12 activities and pedagogical training. That's what you were supporting today. And I do want to clarify, folks, for the matching gift that I mentioned, we have $30,000 being offered by our advisory board. That matching gift, you do not have to give today to qualify for that matching gift. That's in our fall campaign. So please consider giving in this calendar year to get that matching gift. And thank you so much. And one more time, let's go back to Gerhard Weinberg.
Thank you. This is not the place for a review of the American military operations in the Pacific, Northwest Africa, and Europe. But what must be stressed is the extent to which the American public followed and supported the war effort. Whether or not families received letters from members stationed and or fighting in faraway places all over the globe, there was now no doubt that the United States was involved in global affairs and would very likely continue to be so. If the slogan, "Remember Pearl Harbor," provided something of a stimulus, the reality was that the overwhelming majority of the public now had a new view of the country's role in the world and would most likely continue to have such a role after victory had been obtained. President Roosevelt did what he could to have the American public not only support the war effort, but also to see itself in a role different from the one it had adopted after World War I. Himself a member of the administration of World War I President Woodrow Wilson, and having been the defeated Democratic candidate for vice president in 1920, he wanted to make sure that this time there would be public support for an America engaged in the world and supporting an international organization. The preliminary planning for the United Nations organization took place in Dumbarton Oaks in the Washington, D.C. area. The conference to establish it was held in San Francisco, and its structure and meetings were to be located in New York, all in the U.S. Several other international organizations were also established during the war. And I would suggest that the appointee to head one of the most important and publicized of them, the United Nations Recovery and Relief Organization, UNRWA, was Herbert Lehman of New York. That was not a coincidence. Similarly, Roosevelt did not want the concept of deterrence abandoned by the United States after World War II as it had been after World War I. That concept had been developed in the Peace Conference of 1814-1815, when the victors over Napoleon decided that the way to keep the French from sending their armies all over the European continent, as they had recently done, the Rhineland area bordering France on the east would be incorporated into Prussia, so that if the French ever started such actions again, they would run into a major power immediately, with other powers joining the attacked state. While the French had not run all over Europe again, the Germans had utilized the acquired land as the basis for twice heading west into France in 1870 and in 1914. At the 1919 Peace Conference, the French therefore advocated separating the area from Germany into a separate state. The American and British leaders at the Peace Conference saw and opposed this proposal as a violation of the nationality principle that was to be applied in the peace settlement. To obtain French agreement to leaving the area within the German state, the American and British leaders instead agreed to sign treaties with France that provided that their countries would go to war in support of France if the Germans did it a third time, in the hope that the prospect of such a combination against them would deter the Germans. No guide at the American cemetery near Omaha Beach in Normandy will tell visitors that the thousands of American soldiers who are buried there and in other cemeteries in France paid with their lives for the U.S. refusal to ratify and implement the Treaty of Guarantee if Germany invaded France from the Rhineland a third time. Roosevelt picked as his vice president and successor Harry Truman, who had been one of the hundreds of thousands of American soldiers who in World War I had crossed the Atlantic Ocean in a troop ship, disembarked at a port in France, and fought on the Western Front. Like Roosevelt, Truman was a believer in deterrence. Most have heard of the Truman Doctrine and NATO. Deterrence was to be a key part of American foreign policy after the Second World War and came to be supported as a central element in this country's policy by both political parties. As the war developed after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and the American public overwhelmingly supported the war effort, American troops became increasingly involved in fighting all over the world, while American warships crossed oceans and fought in waters all over the world. That process brought Americans into places they had never heard of or thought about before, while simultaneously providing vast numbers of members of the local population contact with the members of a society they might have heard about but had never seen. Whether the conclusions the members of American or local societies drew about the other were favorable or unfavorable, both developed a view of the world that was in many ways different from the perspectives they had held before. The longest battle in American history was that on Guadalcanal from early August 1942 to mid-February 1943. While Americans followed the news of that fighting, practically none had ever heard of the island before the war, and the local population might have heard of the existence of the United States. But the war brought two distant peoples into a new relationship, at least for a while. People in Europe generally knew of the existence of the United States, and Americans had heard about most of the European countries, and many Americans knew something about the country from which they or their ancestors had come to the United States. But in this regard also, there were entirely new aspects in public perspectives and assumptions. The act of Japan in drawing the United States into the war by a Sunday morning attack in peacetime had a special ramification for American aims in the war. The United States had agreed to a negotiated armistice and treaty to end World War I, and also agreed to an armistice in its next war, the Korean War. This time, it would be different. Franklin Roosevelt would have preferred forcing Germany to surrender unconditionally in World War I, but had kept quiet about the issue as a loyal member of the Wilson administration. This time, that would be the policy of the United States, and first the British, and much later the Soviet Union, came to agree to it. A most important global ramification of the attack on Pearl Harbor was the dramatic change in the whole course and impact of the war that resulted from the participation in it that the attack forced on the United States. If the U.S. had not been forced to fight Japan, the latter would certainly have continued its war against China. How that would have developed over subsequent years, and whether it would have been followed by a major civil war between the Chinese nationalists and communists, is impossible to say. But all in the Far East would have been very different if the Japanese had decided not to attack the United States, Britain, and Dutch in 1941. It is impossible to assess whether Japan would have carried out its original concept excuse me, of striking in Southeast Asia in 1946 as the war in Europe continued. It is also worth speculating whether Japan would today have a functioning democratic government had it not been defeated and occupied as a result of attacking the United States. The war in Europe and North Africa that was underway when the Japanese drew the United States into it would surely have continued, but in a very different way. Churchill was certainly not about to make an agreement with Hitler. There are clear signs that well into 1943, Stalin was seriously considering a compromise peace agreement of some sort with Germany. But Hitler was absolutely committed to continuing the war and rejected all advice to the country from his allies and from inside his own government. A still neutral United States would, of course, have continued its Lend-Lease aid to Britain, possibly on an even greater scale. The United States was already sending aid to the Soviet Union and would surely have continued to do so. It is, of course, impossible to say whether that would have been on the enormous scale to which it actually came. along with truly vast material supplies, over 14,000 planes, 7,500 tanks, and over 300,000 trucks, to mention just a few examples. One should, however, note that the reduction of American war production, if the country had not been forced into the war, would have been offset by the greatly reduced needs of a far smaller military force than the huge Army, Navy, and Air Force this country actually mobilized. Under these circumstances, in the continuing of the war, the British might at some point in 1943 or 44 have attained complete control of North Africa, in accordance with the Churchill-Stalin agreement on spheres of influence. The British might thereafter have landed troops in Greece, but without the assistance and participation of the United States, there would not have been any invasion of German-occupied Europe from the West. The Red Army would have continued to push westward after crushing the German 1942 and 1943 summer offensives. As actually happened, the Western Allied armies and the Soviet forces met in the middle of Europe. If Japan had not forced the United States into the war, at some time in 1946, 1947, or 1948, Soviet forces would have reached the Atlantic Ocean. Instead of two states in the former Germany, one a parliamentary republic and one a communist dictatorship, there would have been a single communist state, as in Poland and other countries actually overrun by the Red Army in 1944 and 1945. Both Churchill and General Eisenhower pushed Field Marshal Montgomery to move his forces in northern Germany forward as rapidly as possible in order to reach the Baltic Sea and thereby preclude the Red Army from driving into Denmark. The allocation of additional American forces to Montgomery facilitated the success of the Western Allies in reaching Lübeck and Wismar on the Baltic Sea just ahead of the Soviets. I wonder whether there's anyone in Denmark today who realizes that if the Japanese had not driven the United States into the war 80 years ago, Denmark would have been occupied by the Red Army and would have had a communist government for some years after the war. This is just one example of a very different Europe in a world very different from the one that emerged from the war into which Japan pushed this country. There is another way in which the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor undoubtedly changed the world. If the Japanese had not drawn the United States into the war, but had instead concentrated on their effort to control China, the British, French, and Dutch colonies of South and Southeast Asia and in the Pacific would not have been so directly involved in the war as Japan's action did. It seems to me most unlikely that the process of decolonization that followed the end of the war would have been anywhere near as rapid as it was. We know that Churchill not only expected the British Empire to be fully restored and would continue, but he hoped to expand it by annexing the southern portion of Thailand to it so that the British colonies of Burma and Malaya would have a common border. Nothing of the sort happened. Similarly, the leader of the Free French, Charles de Gaulle, wanted to expand the French colonial empire at the expense of Italy's colony of Libya, and also annex a piece of Italy to southeast France. In a bitter dispute with President Truman, the latter project was dropped, while the former was also aborted. The wider upheaval of the war created by Japan's action surely speeded up the whole process of decolonization that the United States favored and in a way symbolized. According to a Japanese plan for dividing the world among the powers of the tripartite when they won the war, North Carolina was to be one of the 47 states of the United States that would be ruled by Germany. The state's largest city, Charlotte, is named for a British Hanoverian queen, and a statue of her stands in the city's airport today. But the state is not a part of either a British or a German colonial empire. The process of moving from colonial status to independence that we celebrate on July 4th was, as I already mentioned, speeded up all over the world by the event of December 7th. If the United States had not been drawn into the war by the attack on Pearl Harbor, would there have been any difference in what we now call the Holocaust? The process of systematic killing of Jews had been initiated by the Germans half a year earlier, and as the study of Yaron Pasha demonstrates, had such a high priority in German wartime policy that it was repeatedly allowed to interfere with military developments. It would therefore have continued, and the increasing length of the war would have enabled the Germans to kill even more Jews in the territory they still held and in which they were trying hard to locate additional victims. The one effort, President Roosevelt made to rescue Jews, the bringing of several hundred as temporary visitors, not immigrants, into this country to Fort Ontario in Oswego, New York, led to the immediate initiation of impeachment proceedings in the Congress. It is no coincidence that these were dropped in the same week that the White House announced that there would be no further such steps. If there was serious willingness of many in Congress to impeach the commander-in-chief in the middle of the country's involvement in a world war, there would surely have been even more enthusiasm for such a step if the United States had remained neutral. Thus, the absence of any direct interference with the killing program was not affected by Pearl Harbor, though American forced participation in the conflict led to its earlier end. The action of Japan in forcing the United States into the Second World War certainly had many ramifications all over the world, both inside countries and colonies, and in regard to boundaries between them. I hope that this talk sheds a little light on some of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. You can hear, those of you out in the ether can hear our very small online, in studio audience clapping, and thank you so much for that. I do want to remind everyone that we are holding this event today as our fundraiser for Carolina Public Humanities to help us recuperate from losses that we estimate around $200,000 over the pandemic, and that we hope will help sustain us with our projects going forward. I want to invite all of you. This is where the real treat begins, because as many of you who have seen Gerhard do his talks before, the question and answer session is where the full depth of his knowledge really becomes revealed. After that incredibly compelling look at the global ramifications, we now welcome your questions, and I'm going to get right to them. Dr. Weinberg, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
All right. Well, let's get started with these questions. We have a question from Ed Block, who asks, how close did Germany come to developing a nuclear weapon before the end of World War II?
They didn't come close at all. They were working on it. And it was our American knowledge of their working on it that led us and also the British to work on it. But essentially, in 1942, Hitler stopped allocating resources to the effort because the predictions he was being given as to when the first ones would be ready were too far in the future, in part, I should add, because of the deliberate destruction by bombing and commandos of some of the facilities the Germans would need to finish the project. So it is safe to predict that even if the United States had not been drawn into the war, there was no real chance after 1942-43, as the war continued, as I suggested, into 46, 47, 48, the Germans had in effect given up.
Okay, great. We have a question here from Bob Warren, who asks, Hitler declared war on the U.S. December 11th. Why, if he had not, would Roosevelt have declared war on Germany?
Well, if Hitler, if the Germans and Italians had not declared war on the United States would not have declared war on them. As I mentioned, in the case of these other three European countries that declared war on us, when we were already at war with Germany, Italy, and Japan, Roosevelt tried to get them to withdraw their declarations of war. But you see, if the Japanese had not been absolutely certain that Germany and Italy would join them, the Japanese, as they had told the Germans, were not going to war with the United States. They were going to wait until 1946, when the Philippines were independent and the United States, well, we still had the island of Guam, but that wouldn't have bothered the Japanese in seizing the Philippines, Malaya, India, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, and a few other things.
Okay. We have a question here from Douglas Anderson, who asks, was war declared on Finland declared by the U.S.? I know that the Finnish capital was the only Axis capital that was not occupied by the World War II Allied powers. So I guess the question is, how did the United States end up going to war with Finland?
The United States did not go to war with Finland.
Okay.
The reality is this. In American public thinking, whether accurate or inaccurate, the Finns were the only ones who had been paying off their borrowing from the First World War. And therefore, when in the winter of 41-42, Great Britain, in response to requests from the Soviet Union, declared war on several of Germany's allies, they quite deliberately did not declare war on Finland. And so this country, Finland, did not declare war on the United States, and the United States did not declare war on Finland. That did not eliminate a couple of incidents in connection with our sending supplies to the North Russian port of Murmansk, which had to go past an area that the Red Army had occupied in the Winter War of 39-40, but had returned to Finland in a place called Petsamo. But we were not going to go to war with Finland.
Okay, thank you for that. We have a question from Alan Roberts. If Japan had continued their operations in China and proceeded into action against British, French, and Dutch possessions in Indochina, leaving the Philippines alone but still under U.S. control, would the U.S. have acted, or would the pro-isolation forces in the U.S. have kept us on the sidelines?
Well, Japan was not going to do that. It was too risky until 1946 for them. That is to say, as they explained to the Germans, they were planning and hoping to go into South and Southeast Asia and take all those areas. But as a look at this map will show you, you could not go into these areas without going right by the Philippines. And there, the United States was going to be in control of the islands until 44, and with naval bases there until 46. They didn't pick the date 46 by throwing a dart at calendars. They picked it by looking at the map. But in 46, the United States would have given up its main East Asian territory, and the Japanese thinking was that by then we can not only take the British, French, and Dutch territories, we can take the Philippines too while we're at it. And as I am sure everybody here knows, as soon as they started the war, they also started going after the Philippines. And because nobody was willing to wake up General MacArthur while he was asleep, the majority of American warplanes on the northern island of the Philippines, Luzon, were destroyed by the Japanese Air Force, pulling off a similar stunt as they had at Pearl Harbor a few hours before, and then subsequently landing Japanese troops on the northern island of Luzon. And while there was a big battle there, which lasted until the first week of May of 42, they were going to take the Philippines while they were at it. And of course, that's what they hoped to do in 46 after the United States was no longer there. But they were willing to do it in 1941 as long as they were certain that Germany and Italy would be in the war with the United States alongside them.
Great, thank you for that. We have a question from Tom Zutlow. Were there any long-term ramifications of Japan not formally declaring war on the U.S. before the attack on Pearl Harbor?
Yes, I think there were. It's one thing to declare war on another country and then start fighting it. The other country figures, well, we're at war. The idea of attacking another country on a Sunday in peacetime without having made the declaration of war not only starts the war, obviously, but has what you might call a public relations impact. In the United States, there was, from the beginning, a kind of hatred produced by this action that lasted until 1945. It is true that afterwards in the occupation, it was much more friendly in Germany and much in Japan and much more hostile in Germany. But during the war, the memory of this, what President Roosevelt in his speech called Day of Infamy, had a major impact on the American public and on its insistence. It's worth noting, I recall this as a teenager at the time, in that long, long battle on Guadalcanal, a place that nobody in this country really ordinarily knew about or cared about before or after, but the public followed on the radio and in the newspapers. This is no TV yet. And the same thing was true in the spring of '45, the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. The fighting on Okinawa, which runs all of April, May, and effectively the end of June. It's the one where the American casualties are the heaviest of any battle in the Pacific War. There was no contrary argument. If that's where we have to fight the Japs, that's where we'll fight the Japs. No, no argument about it. It was just simply, they had started this, and Americans had heard about the terrible mistreatment of American and Filipino prisoners by the Japanese in the Death March in 1942, and the general mistreatment of American POWs by the Japanese. All that reinforced, if you will, the cohesion of the American public behind the war.
Thank you for that. I want to remind everyone there, we can take questions in the question and answer button at the bottom of the screen. And as you'll see, Dr. Weinberg will answer anything about World War II, even if it's not directly about Pearl Harbor, so feel free. I also want to remind you folks that we are in the middle of our fundraiser, so please take advantage of this time if you are so inclined to give to Carolina Public Humanities. Gifts of any amount are greatly appreciated, and of course all gifts are tax deductible. So if you are so inclined, please consider giving to Carolina Public Humanities today. And let's get right back to some of your questions. We have a question from Moira Kilef. From the Japanese viewpoint, the Americans provoked them to take action against the U.S. because the U.S. have been cutting off oil supplies. Is this true? Is this a valid?
It is false, I'm afraid. The reality was that in the fall of 1940, you get the Japanese occupied the northern part of French Indochina and thereby cut off supplies to the nationalists from the port there, the Hanoi Haiphong Railway, and simultaneously pressured the British into temporarily closing the Burma Road. In other words, these were parts of their effort someday or some decade to finish the war with China. And since the United States was helping China some, we reduced our trade agreement with Japan, but kept selling them oil. The change comes when, in order, as a part of their preparations for war with the United States and so on, the Japanese occupy southern French Indochina, away from their war with China. And it's at that point that we decide, why should we do what Stalin did? Roosevelt decided. He had warned Stalin that the Germans were going to attack him. And the German tanks that rolled into the Soviet Union in June of 1941 were using gasoline that Adolf's dear friend Stalin had provided him. The United States, Roosevelt's view, did not need to provide the Japanese Navy with oil to attack the United States. we knew that China did not have a navy. That is the Chinese nationalist government. And what I think is very interesting is that in the latter stages of the negotiations in 1941, someone from the outside, so to speak, suggested that if the Japanese would evacuate southern French Indochina, the United States would sell them all the oil they could possibly want. The Tokyo Japanese government immediately instructed the Japanese embassy in Washington that they were under no circumstances to discuss, never mind agree, such a project. The American military intercepted and decoded this message. And it was when this happened, shortly before the Japanese moved, that the War Department sent messages to the American military forces in Alaska, Hawaii, and the Panama Canal zone that Japan was very likely to attack, and they had better watch out for this, because that's the way they had started war with Russia back in 1904. As soon as the big difference is the northern part of French Indochina was the place through which aid was going to the Chinese nationalists. Southern French Indochina points to attack on Malaya, on the Philippines, on the Dutch East Indies. And as I said, our government saw no reason in providing the Japanese with the oil for this. But if they would abandon their plan to attack us and the British and the Dutch, we'd sell them all the oil they could possibly want.
Thank you for that. I want to remind folks too, you can put your questions in the question and answer button at the bottom. If you are raising your hand in the chat, we see that, but we can't access your questions unless you type them in at the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. So go ahead and please do that if you'd like us to engage with your questions. This is the $1 million question that everyone, many people have wanted to ask, and Ed Block is stepping up and asking, did U.S. intelligence have any prior knowledge of the attack on Pearl Harbor?
None whatever. We had the knowledge that Japan attacked people without warning, and that was why warnings were sent to the forces, as I just mentioned, in Alaska, Hawaii, and the Panama Canal zone. But we had no clue as to the specific thing that the Japanese, we now know, were planning. And before they carried that plan out, they, as I said, asked to make sure that the Germans and Italians were still with them if they went forward.
Great, thank you for that. We have a question here from, I hope I pronounced the last name right, John Kokowicz. What impact value did the conference at Yalta play in the final push to end the war in Europe and the Pacific? Was this conference important in ending the war in both theaters?
The conference in Yalta in early 45 certainly coordinated some of the final stages of the war in Europe. In it, Stalin made clear, as he had before, and would make even clearer in July 45 at the Potsdam meeting, that the Soviet Union would join the war against Japan 3 months after the war in Europe was over. But we have to look at this for a moment in terms of the way Stalin thought. Government leaders make their decisions and choices on the basis of what they believe and they think. Not what I think, not what you think, but what they think. And Stalin would, during his years of alignment with Hitler, from late August 39 till June 41, would do a number of things for his dear friend Adolf that he would never dream of doing for his allies, Britain and the United States, after the Germans attacked him. And from his point of view, just as it looked back in 39 to him that it was a great thing for those wretched capitalist countries to fight each other, he had a somewhat similar view towards the war in the Pacific. It was, from his perspective, a nice thing that the Japanese and Americans and Brits were fighting. And the longer it lasted, the better it was from his point of view. He would never provide us, that is the US, with the kind of help in fighting that he had provided Hitler during the years before Germany attacked the Soviet Union. But he was also of the opinion that once it was very clear that the war in Europe was over and the Americans were in a position to move forces from Europe to the Pacific, if he was going to gain things in the Pacific, he'd have to get into that war too. And so he promised to do that, and as we know, almost missed, because the atomic bombs ended the war in the Pacific a good deal sooner than either he or we had anticipated.
Great, thank you for that answer. And I wanted to just echo some of the comments we're getting that are just comments lauding your absolutely encyclopedic knowledge of World War II. And we're all absolutely amazed every time we ask you a question. You have not just one answer, but 5 answers to it. And people are praising you. Thank you all for joining us. We have more questions to get to. Thank you all for joining us today. I do want to remind you folks, we are doing this as a fundraiser today to help make up for our $200,000 estimated losses since COVID. So if you'd like to help us today, please consider giving to Carolina Public Humanities and keep giving us your questions like this one from Douglas Anderson. In your opinion, to what extent did the Japanese manpower commitments to the Chinese theater of operations make less available Japanese forces that could better oppose the American military efforts in the South Pacific and elsewhere?
There's no question that the continued commitment of Japan to the war against China interfered with their war against this country and Britain. That's particularly obvious in the summer of 1944, when the Japanese make their last major offensives. They make a major offensive in China and largely destroy much of Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces, in part to keep the United States from using airports in nationalist China to fly to Japan and bomb it. Simultaneously, because the combined British and American forces were holding on and held off Japanese offensive in Burma, we're supplying Chiang Kai-shek. And the ironically largest Japanese army defeat of World War II occurs in Burma, of all places, when they besiege a couple of towns there in the middle of Burma, and the British Indian Army under Field Marshal Slim holds them and defeats them. Obviously, the Japanese at this time, we're talking about summer 44, were in Burma not as a part of their colonial expansion, but as a part of their war against China and trying to keep the Americans and Brits from helping the Chinese nationalists. But for obvious reasons, those troops could not fight on some island in the Pacific, whether it was Attu in the north, or Niuatak or Tarawa in the south, New Guinea or Borneo, or in the Philippines, simultaneously. So that the Americans, although they faced strong Japanese resistance as they moved forward in the Central Pacific operation under Nimitz and the Southwest Pacific operation under MacArthur, there would have been lots more troops facing them if the Japanese had not been busy in China. And this, of course, was one of the reasons why the United States was so interested in supporting the Chinese nationalist armies with supplies, keep as much of the Japanese army busy on the continent, and there was quite enough of it of fighting us on the islands in the Pacific. And keep in mind that the plan and intent was that in November of 45, we were going to invade the southern Kyushu of the Japanese main islands, and that was going to be an entirely American force. And in the spring of 46, Operation Coronet, we were going into a part of Tokyo Bay, and while the first wave of that attack was to be American, the second was to include British and French troops. We needed whatever we could get, and therefore the more of the Japanese were busy elsewhere, and that's also the better for us. And that is also why MacArthur was pushing President Roosevelt to make concessions to the Russians to get them into the war against Japan, because he saw what was going to be a very, very difficult set of operations, Olympic and Coronet, to which by that time, of course, Roosevelt was dead. Truman was the president from April 12th on 45. But the more Japanese troops were elsewhere, the better we like it. And we kept helping the Russians because we figured the more German troops are busy on the Eastern Front, the fewer of them will be on the Western Front in France and on the Southern Front in Italy.
Makes sense. We have a question here from Bruce Babcock. Were most citizens of Germany and Japan in favor of their country's violent and unwarranted invasions in Europe and Asia?
For obvious reasons, it is not easy to answer that because neither of these countries was in the habit of holding votes as to whether they should go to the war or not. The answer I would suggest is that there was overwhelming support in Germany for the wars. And that continues in a very high proportion of the population to the bitter end. In Japan, there was certainly support, but it is never quite as strong and as enthusiastic as in Germany. And I think that has something to do with the total difference in attitudes in both directions. Americans hated the Japanese and didn't much hate the Germans, but from 45 on, it's reversed. We get along well with the Japanese, and hearing about all the atrocities, Americans are much more anti-German. And the other side of this is that the occupation in Germany is much rougher and has to be much rougher because there are all kinds of incidents. And American soldiers in the American zone of occupation in Germany have to carry weapons all the time. In Japan, it's just the opposite way. Everything is quiet and calm. The Japanese smile and wave at the Americans. American soldiers there are not carrying weapons. I don't mean the military police with their revolver. That was a part of their uniform. But from the very beginning of the occupation in Japan, things are quiet. There are not the incidents. The people get along. Americans pass food to Japanese kids. It's all a very, very different situation. And my personal experience reinforces that. And when I talk to cousins and friends who were simultaneously back in 46, 47 in the occupation in Germany, it was just a fundamentally different situation.
We have a similar question from Jonathan Gerard addressing, basically comparing Germany and Japan and their role with the United States. I'm going to read how he's phrased this. Could you address the irony that prior to World War I, Britain and France were the world leaders, but after World War II, the losers, Germany and Japan, in alliance with the U.S., became some of the world's leading nations economically? Did anyone in the U.S. government see the two world wars as an opportunity for the U.S. to replace Britain and, to a lesser degree, France in the hierarchy of nations, bringing Germany and Japan into our economic sphere?
I don't think that they were thinking in those terms. As I mentioned in my talk, President Roosevelt was very concerned, very interested in the role of the United States in the post-war world, and that this was all to be 100% different from what it had been after World War I. And whether he was right or wrong in this is not the point. I mean, the evidence as to his views and efforts in this regard are very, very clear. And in a general way, Truman held the same views. The major point in both cases was that France and England had reached, if you will, the peak of their power and world role around 1900. And the process of decolonization, which had begun slowly a little bit before the Second World War, was enormously speeded up by the Second World War, as I mentioned, and that implied reduction. What you have to keep in mind is that Germany and Japan were both, by the time of the Second World War, highly industrialized societies with a population base that was larger than that of either England or France. The population of Japan was almost twice that of England. The population of Germany was half again that of France, or 2/3 again out of France. And with industry and technological development, they were going to move forward. And if we could get them to develop and maintain and support democratic governments, then the United States would have a different relationship with them. We did not fight the Germans or the Japanese because that was something we'd always wanted to do. We fought them because they insisted on it. And, and when they were smart enough to quit, we would get along with them. In the case of the Germans, it took a little longer because the people there were a little more reluctant and persuaded by the prior regime, whereas the Japanese were much more willing, and their emperor pushed them into that direction.
Thank you for that. We have more questions here. I have a question from our very small in-studio audience of 4 people. So I'm going to go to our in-studio audience here. And I do want to remind everyone, this is our fundraiser for our fall semester, and we'd welcome gifts of any size. And Paul is dropping the humanities giving link there many times. And also remember, folks, we do have a match, very generous match from members of our advisory board who have are going to match gifts up to $30,000. And these gifts can come in any time in the fall campaign, which does go all the way to the end of fall. So you don't have to give exactly today. And we have a question from our online audience.
How much did the Emperor of Japan either participate in or know of the plan for the bombing of Pearl Harbor, obviously prospectively? Was he informed or did he participate in that decision?
To the best of our knowledge, he was, if you will, on a current basis, informed of the plan to go to war. The extent to which he was informed about the details of the Japanese initiative in December is much debated. There's no doubt that he was willing to go along with a war. And the specifics were regularly reported to him by the top military and civilian authorities. But I don't think it is correct to suggest that he was, if you will, running the Japanese war the way Hitler ran large parts of the German war, Stalin ran much of the Soviet war, Churchill ran much of the British war, Mussolini tried to run the Italian war, and Roosevelt played a major role in all the key decisions in the American war. But I think in the case of Hirohito, there was participation and information, but not nearly as much push and shove and detailed knowledge as in the case of the other.
Thank you for that. We have a question from Moira Keelef, the Keelefs. What were the repercussions, possibly still reverberating today, of Iran joining Germany in World War II?
I'm sorry, I could not.
The question was about Iran in World War II and whether Iran joined with Germany. What are the repercussions of what happened in Iran, and are they reverberating today?
The major thing that happened to Iran in World War II was that the Germans hoped to get there, but didn't. And in 1941, not long after Germany attacked the Soviet Union, the British and Russians, who were now allies courtesy of the German invasion of the Soviet Union, proceeded to occupy Iran. From the north, the Russians, from the south, the British, and thereafter, that meant that here there was a railway that would carry supplies landed from the United States, the Lend-Lease program, at Iranian ports, could go by train thereafter into the Soviet Union. And a very substantial portion, I'm sorry I can't give you a percentage figure, but a very substantial portion of American Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union went across there. And the first meeting of Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt took place in Tehran in the fall of '43 in Iran, and obviously that was under Allied military control. They did not meet there to entertain the Iranian population. And so at the end of the war, the Russians took a little longer to withdraw their forces from Iran than the Western Allies, but Iran, if you will, regained independence.
Great, thank you for that. We have a question from our studio audience.
I have read that Admiral Yamamoto did not believe that the war could ever be won. Is that true? And if so, why was his view disregarded by the upper Japanese authorities?
Yamamoto's view was like that of a good many others, that the American people who had attained their independence and were opposed to colonies would not engage in an endless war in order to restore French, British, and Dutch colonies to their colonial owners. And he dreamt up the Pearl Harbor scheme because he thought that Japan, if it destroyed enough of the American Navy, could go and do everything it wanted to for 6 months. And then the American people would not support a continued war, so that Guadalcanal could be a British colony again. This was, in my opinion, a total misjudgment, not only of Yamamoto, but of others. Ironically, the very thing that Yamamoto got the Japanese to substitute for their earlier concept of that if it came to war with the United States, they would invade the Philippines. The American Navy would protect reinforcements to the Philippines, and there would be a major battle in which the Japanese hoped to win. Yamamoto was of the opinion that this was a risky business, and that destroying the American Navy in Pearl Harbor would give the Japanese half a year to do whatever they wanted, and persuaded, because so many of the other top leaders held this same view about the American public, that the American public was against colonialism, was not a startling or erroneous view. But if you start the war the way Yamamoto insisted, with a Sunday morning peacetime attack, that's going to lead the American public to disregard, at least for a while, their anti-colonial views. I cannot recall having followed, at the time, as I said, as a teenager, the fighting on Guadalcanal, no one in this country, to the best of my knowledge, ever suggested that after we finally crushed them and the last Japanese troops are withdrawn in mid-February of 43, we should not give this lovely island back to the Brits. No one suggested that. No one suggested that we should take it. Nobody discussed the issue, was simply not there. And similarly, when our forces went into the Dutch East Indies, as you may know, MacArthur led an invasion of Borneo, which was then partly Dutch, partly British, and partly a semi-independent little country called Brunei. People in this country and in this government neither thought we should have Borneo, nor that when this fighting, when we crushed the Japanese, we'll let the British and the Dutch worry about it. This is even more dramatic in the case of Okinawa. That was Japanese. And while this was in terms of casualties, the costliest battle of the Pacific War, Americans didn't argue about what should happen to Okinawa. We have a base there today, I don't mean that, but the notion that this island should not go back to the Japanese, that it should become an American colony or so and so on. Nobody, it just simply was not an issue. If that's where we have to fight the Japs, that's where we'll fight the Japs. That was the notion. So the whole strategic concept of a temporary Japanese victory followed by a peace with the United States we'll never know if it would have happened. What we do know is that the attack on Pearl Harbor precluded that from ever happening because the Americans were going to crush the Japanese, and it didn't matter where or what it cost.
Thank you for that. We have a question from our friend out there, Hoyt Beard, who writes, I was born in 1939 and remember a few things like blackouts and rationing. What was life and the general conditions like in Japan during the war?
Well into the war, the Japanese home situation was not particularly pleasant, but it wasn't particularly tough. Yes, there was the Doolittle raid in April of 42, but there is no serious direct bombing attack until 44. The ordinary German civilian was twice as likely to get killed in the war as the ordinary Japanese, roughly in statistical terms. What did affect the home situation in Japan were three things. One, increasing number of casualties, obviously leaving families deprived of those members. A second one was that the Japanese at home were dependent not just on oil for their Air Force and their tanks. They were dependent on imports of food and other items. And in the latter part of the war, American and to a lesser extent British and Dutch submarines are having a major impact on the Japanese home front. Also, The third is what the American Air Force does. Not only the direct bombing, which one hears about and reads about a good deal, but what also affected the home front was the American use of the B-29 bomber, not just to bomb Japan, but to drop mines all around Japan. And so the mining and the loss of Japanese ships to mines had a further direct impact on the society. People in Japan were very hungry by the time the war was over. And that affected the situation in the occupation. The first day I was in Zama, 4th Replacement Depot, I was shifted to emergency supply. The warrant officer gives me my first assignment to a place, take 4 trucks to a place, be all day, you'll need lunch, and you go to the mess sergeant and tell him how many trucks you have. And I said, and I, needless to say yes, sir, and ask the other emergency supply GI, what is the connection between my lunch and the number of trucks? And the answer is, oh, well, all the drivers and all the load helpers are 4 members of the Japanese Army, now working for the American Army, and you will distribute lunch to them, and the mess sergeant will give you enough to do it. Needless to say, as a private in the Army, I did as I was told, and stopped the convoy in the countryside, passed out food, and if, as I noticed, one or another put the food or some of it in a pocket, I wouldn't say a word. Obviously, it was going home to somebody hungry there. And when I told this story to my brother, when we were, who was a year and a half older and who was in the occupation from the first day, he immediately said, oh, we were in this barbed wire surrounded tent area in Tokyo. And after a couple of days, when we left after breakfast, there were Japanese kids waiting outside. And we would give them food. And the mess control people quickly increased the piles. And everybody involved understood. This was the long-term effect of the American blockade of Japan by bombing, but particularly by the American submarines and the American mines. And that had a big effect on the home front of Japan.
This is, you might have addressed this, but somewhat with the bombing, but Gary Wallach asked, did the U.S. need to bomb the Japanese cities?
Well, there's a lot of argument over this.
And Gerhard, I want to throw one thing
I'm
out.
sorry.
Oh, no, it's just fine. I just realized we also have a question that then goes on to ask about the necessity of the atomic bomb. So if you want to go about from the conventional bombing, whether it was necessary, and then about the nuclear bombs.
The conventional bombing was started from the Marianas, Tinian and Saipan, that we'd taken, landed on in the summer of '44. And it didn't seem to have much effect. So the commander was replaced by LeMay, Curtis LeMay, who figured that we should not try to hit factories from up high, but burn the cities down from a lower level with incendiaries. That certainly had an enormous effect in terms of what happened and how many people were killed. but it also had a major effect on Japanese industry. Some of it was burned, and a lot of the workers were killed or injured. Whether the earlier one's procedure of what you might call targeted bombing would have been equally effective is a very difficult question to answer. We won't know. On the atomic bombs, it was very clear that the Japanese were going to continue to fight, and that we were going to have to launch Olympic in November of 45, Coronet in the spring of 46. March, I believe, was the date. I think there's a side to this that is very rarely mentioned, so I will take it up. While there are lots of arguments as to what the Allied casualties, American, British, Canadian, French, Soviet, the Chinese would have been if the war had continued, there was unanimous agreement in the top level in Japan that when the Americans and Allies landed in Japan, there would be 20 million Japanese casualties. The two atomic bombs between them produced roughly 250,000 casualties. I'm talking about the combined dead and seriously injured. That may make it a little easier to understand why a few years after the war, the Japanese government gave General LeMay, awarded General Curtis LeMay, who was in charge of the atomic bombing, the highest decoration that Japan can give to a foreigner. The number of people who have saved Japan 19,750,000 casualties cannot be very large. There is the other side to that that is rarely mentioned, which is why I thought I would call it to your attention. It is worth noting that the moment LeMay asked from the Marianas, as the third bomb arrived and others were coming, about dropping a third, he was immediately instructed, orally and in writing, under no circumstances to drop the third. We had dropped the third to get the Japanese to surrender, and the second, when they didn't, to give the impression that we had an indefinite supply. And that worked. The third, fourth, fifth, sixth, etc., were all going to be saved up to support Operation Olympic. We dropped on Kyushu and nearby areas in support of Operation Olympic. There was, in other words, a very clear decision by Truman and his associates. We'll do this to try to get the Japanese to end the war now, and if they don't want to, if they refuse, we go forward. There was no question in the minds of Truman, Stimson, the Secretary of State for War, and others, and will invade.
Great, thank you for that. I want to thank you folks out there in the ether for sticking with us for this program. We have about a few more questions left and more time to get to them. I also want to remind you, of course, this is our fall fundraiser, and we do hope that you consider giving to Carolina Public Humanities to help us sustain our programs, both for K-12 teacher outreach, community college outreach, and our general operations as well. All gifts are greatly appreciated of any size, and of course all are tax deductible. So please consider giving today, and let's get back to some of your questions. I'm going to try to combine a couple questions here because they touch on some of the same ideas. One is from Tom Zitlo asks, the attack on Pearl Harbor did not destroy the U.S. aircraft carriers.
did the Japanese High Command still consider the attack a tactical success, even though warfare was moving away from battleships to air power?
We have to realize that in the time that we're talking about, 40, 41, everybody still thought that the battleship was the most important thing. And it is worth noting that because of that, both the Japanese and the Germans decided that the only way to cope with the American battleships and the possibility of the U.S. building more was to build super battleships and cope with the 14, 15-inch guns of the American battleships with super battleships carrying 18-inch guns. The Japanese started 4, scrapped 1 and worked on 3, finished 2 of them, the Yamamoto and the Musashi. The third, the Shinano, was to be converted into an aircraft carrier and was sunk by an American submarine. I've always thought it appropriate that what would have been the largest aircraft carrier ever was sunk by a submarine. But in any case, the Germans laid down the keels for the first super battleships in February of 1939, but never finished any of them. Now, one has to see this as a part of long-term planning for war with the United States. And the other side of this question was what?
The other side of this question actually is that it's somewhat related, but this is from Jack Bowers. I've read that it was known that Japanese war games involved studying an attack on Pearl Harbor. Is this true? Was the U.S. at least aware that this was a possibility, that Pearl Harbor would be a target of an attack?
This had been in exercises before, was thought a possibility, and as I mentioned, the special warning on that subject goes to Hawaii, but they decided, number one, playing golf was more fun, and number two, if there was an attack, it would not be from the air, but it would be from people of Japanese descent living in Hawaii, in other words, sabotage. And so they were looking for sabotage rather than air attack. The Japanese certainly knew that aircraft carriers were important, and they were very disappointed that the American aircraft carriers were not in Pearl Harbor, but had shortly before left to take airplanes to Midway. That is, to carry them to Midway and be used there. But the other side of that was that even if they had been in Pearl Harbor, people need to consider the realities of Pearl Harbor. It's not very deep. Of the 8 battleships that the Japanese imagined they had sunk, 2, Arizona and Oklahoma, stayed sunk. The other 6 were rebuilt, returned to service. Ironically, in the one major battleship engagement in the Surigao Straits in October of 44, all but one of the American battleships that win that engagement were battleships Yamamoto imagined he'd sunk in Pearl Harbor.
Wow.
If the aircraft carriers had been there, as the Japanese would have preferred, they would no doubt have bombed them and damaged them. But there's no reason to overlook the fact that big warships can only sink so deep in Pearl Harbor. There were a couple of thousand deaths, but the overwhelming majority of the crew members of the American warships in Pearl Harbor survived. And uh, the trained people were there afterwards. The situation fundamentally different from what happened earlier that year when there was a surface engagement between the British and the Germans in the Denmark Straits. The British battlecruiser Hood went down, 2 survivors. Then the Bismarck is dropped. Out of 2,600 aboard, 130 survived. Nothing like what happened at Pearl Harbor. That is to say, the overwhelming majority of the crew members survived. I don't want to minimize the losses, but in terms of a long-term war, the same thing would have been true if the aircraft carriers had been there. Yes, it would have been a big blow, but the United States was not only in a position to repair them if they were, in quotation marks, sunk into the mud of Pearl Harbor, it was building lots of them. And by the time we're advancing across the Central Pacific, we have literally dozens of aircraft carriers, both the big ones and then the escort carriers. So I won't say it made no difference, but it did not make anywhere near as large a difference as the Japanese imagined when they learned that they weren't there.
Great, thank you for that. I'm afraid we're coming right up to the end of our time here, but I'm going to have time for one more question, and Sarah Malone has asked a question. You mentioned bringing the aircraft carriers were bringing planes to Midway. Sarah Malone asks, what is the relationship in timing and impact of the Battle of Midway and the attack on Pearl Harbor? What is the relationship between those two events?
The relationship is that the attack on Pearl Harbor gave the Japanese an opportunity to expand their empire all over the place, and then to make the decision to try to take Midway and Pearl Harbor and in that way push forward their outer defense line much further, several hundred, perhaps 1,000 miles further into the Pacific. And so they hoped to do this, but in the Battle of Midway, the Japanese lose 4 aircraft carriers, including several of those that had been in the Pearl Harbor attack. And the United States loses 1 to a submarine shortly thereafter. So the interconnection is that from the Japanese point of view, the attack on Pearl Harbor, in their view, facilitated the likelihood of the conquest of Midway and Hawaii. But it turned out that it led to their worst naval defeat of the war.
Dr. Weinberg, you are absolutely just a fount of knowledge. We are also absolutely impressed. I want you to put our hands together for Dr. Gerhard Weinberg. And the small amount of applause you hear in this room is amplified by 20 with our people out there. I want to thank all of you folks. Thank you, Gerhard. I want to thank all of you folks for joining us. I want to remind you this has been our fall fundraiser. We are so grateful that you would consider giving to Carolina Public Humanities in this, our time of need. We remind you we have a wonderful incentive, a matching gift from our advisory board. These funds will be matched all the way up to the end of the year. If you can give anytime between now and then. thank you again for considering giving to Carolina Public Humanity. All gifts are greatly appreciated of any size, and of course, all are tax deductible. Our work is absolutely critical to the health of the state, and we appreciate your support in all of its forms, coming to our programs and supporting us in all that we do. Thank you, Gerhard, one more time. It's really absolutely just fascinating here. I will forward. We have some questions that were given that we didn't have a time to get to, but I will forward them to you, and you can answer them on your own, or if you want to forward them to the people, we'll be happy to do that. One more time, our audience, thank you. And I want to thank Paul Bonici, who's just done such amazing work, not just tonight, but he's also running another program simultaneously with Carolina K-12, and he's been doing this all the way through COVID. So thank you, Paul. You're an absolute champ, really. Folks, have a wonderful 2021, 2022. I see great things for us, and maybe we'll even get to see each other's faces a little bit more. We'll see you next time. Thank you so much.